Well, I'm glad you came out. Going to have a good time. And I'm going to invite Joel up here. Can you hear me out there? Yep. Looks good, though. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I've been enjoying this. Thank you so much, Keone, for putting in the time. I understand you put a few hours into this one. And it's benefiting us, so I appreciate it. But we're going to start out, I'll have a prayer, and then I'm going to have a conversation with Joel and see what we can learn. So let's pray together. Father in heaven, we're gathered again, and there are good things to come out of this time together. And we ask for your guidance in it, especially as Keone shares things that he spent a lot of time that can save us time as we try to understand the world we live in. Bless that communication of those things and our conversations. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I've asked Joel to share his perspective on fear as a parole officer. I don't know if there's any scary things in parole officer work. But So what do you do? What is the difference between your role and normal, officer who pulls you over on the street?
Well, there's a couple of major differences between a parole probation officer and your, like an Alaska State Trooper. Now, we both, as part of our badge, we serve and protect. But a probation officer is specifically supervising a very targeted, narrow population of people that have already been convicted of a crime, and they're either on parole by the parole board or probation by the court. So the arrest authority that a probation parole officer has is narrowly targeted to that population. If we are working in the field and we discover evidence of a new crime, for example, we will call the troopers to come assist us. We might detain somebody, but we will not arrest them. So there's subtle differences. Also, a probation officer, especially in today's environment, in some ways we are a little bit of a social worker as well as a police, so to speak. While one thing is to help the individual re-enter the community and also protect the community. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin. One is to help the individual with rehabilitation, and the other side is to also protect the public and the general public at large from that individual if they choose to make bad decisions.
And I realize that a lot of your work is just confidential stuff. So do not feel pressured to share what you're not supposed to share. But just there are things that are not confidential that can help us understand. And specifically, I'm thinking you're working with people who are in tough situations. They're facing tough consequences. What type of fear do you see in the lives of the people you work with?
Well, a lot of people are very fearful and afraid of their probation officer. And I think one of the most negative consequences of fear is a lack of honesty. I think a lot of people will not disclose things that actually are pretty innocuous, or maybe I'm not using the right word, but they're not harmful or they wouldn't hurt them, but they won't tell us because they're afraid of us. So fear is definitely a big aspect, and to have a trusting relationship with somebody who has the authority to potentially lock you up and put you back in jail is a difficult ask, but it's something that I'm always trying to work for, to earn in the right situations, to earn somebody's trust. Fear is a big obstacle to overcome. Attitude makes a big difference. I think the easiest people sometimes it's almost you would think that people who were had committed the worst crimes would probably be the hardest people to supervise. And it's in some ways it's almost an inverse of that. Some of the easiest people to supervise are people who have committed a very heinous crime like murder. They don't feel like it is in their, they don't feel entitled, while sometimes people who have not done too much yet, and or maybe they're on for a DUI or something, they're much more difficult because they have a lot more of an attitude. So fear is a big obstacle to overcome, earning their trust. And also, you know, I think of Adam and Eve in the garden. When you do something wrong, the human inclination is to hide. There's a lot of, you know, I think of even as Adventists, we talk about being in a time of probation before probation closes and Jesus comes back, and we're all in the valley of decision. You know, in a lot of ways, we're all on probation. Well, we are, and you know, God is the ultimate judge. So, and we think of how fear leads us to hide from God and be dishonest. So, fear is a huge component because it's the natural human reaction to, in some ways, when we've done something wrong. And we don't always trust that we have a good judge or somebody that will treat us fairly and hear our side of the story.
That's a powerful illustration, because how do you trust somebody who's there to help you that has the power to put you in a bad place? And yeah, the character of God is a big deal because we can trust God, but also human relationships. How do we not fear someone who's there to help us when, if we mess up, it could be bad? That's very relatable. And I'm thinking about riots and law enforcement not being portrayed in a good light and people feeling like law enforcement is bad. How does that impact your work when you're representing a group that some people don't really like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I actually brought a quote that I really like that is related to that. If I can get to my screenshots here. It's by Alexander Hamilton. He said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government, men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." So, police abuse of power and brutality. I think a lot of that is based on ignorance, but it does happen. In Alaska, what I've seen for the most part is that our local law enforcement, the state troopers, Wasilla Police, Palmer Police, are very professional. There is definitely throughout the United States, in different areas, there's a lot more racial tension. Here in Alaska, if you go out to some of the bush communities, there's definitely a tension where if you are white and you walk into a native village, it doesn't matter whether you're law enforcement or not, they're probably not going to trust you. If you're law enforcement, they're going to trust you. So that would probably be the closest we get to that. There's definitely a bad attitude in the community with some individuals towards where it's just almost a contempt or a lack of respect towards anybody in authority. And some of it, I think, is misguided. But approach determines response. I try to be, I always think what they're saying says more about them than it says about me. So if somebody starts to get under my skin, and I might react in a way that's harsher than I should, you know, that's kind of my paradigm I operate off of when I'm approaching somebody. This last week we did on Wednesday and Thursday we had a big warrant sweep. We called it Operation Unlucky Charms, as it's almost St. Patrick's Day. We arrested 51 people in the valley here on Wednesday and Thursday, and we encountered quite a few people in the local area who were weren't happy to see us, and they let that be known that they didn't like that we were there on their compound or property arresting somebody there, and they felt like we were violating their rights. But they had people there with an active warrant, and they were sheltering a fugitive. So, we were polite to them, but I saw a lot of restraint on the part of the troopers and the marshals and the other people that were there. And overall, I would say our community has a pretty good degree of respect if you took just a sample of the population towards law enforcement. I haven't seen a lot of abuse of power up here.
So as a pastor, I've never gone to work in body armor. Is there an element of fear and danger when you go out on stuff like that?
Absolutely. A couple things, and I was thinking about that before I came in here today, and I wanted to share this from our office. One of the first things they told me when I went to Palmer and started working in the field unit is, there's no person in this community that it's worth your life to go catch. So at the end of the day, we want to go home to our kids, our wife, our family, and we can always wait for backup. We can always, and so we try to be careful and measured, and we try to create our own, we try to control the situation when we will contact somebody. However, there is always a degree of risk. But so we have that paradigm of, these guys aren't worth risking my life over. But you flip that to Jesus, where for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, where he came and rescued us from a dark, dying world, and he gave his life for the chance that we could turn our life around. So we have an attitude that we're not going to take any risk that isn't absolutely necessary, and even then we're going to try to make it so you lose and not us. Well, Jesus was willing to really step out, and I just think that's a powerful paradigm. Fear, it can cause a lot of good things, can keep a lot of good things from happening. It can keep us from saying something when maybe we should. It can, if we're afraid of, if I was always thinking of myself when there's a lot of things we wouldn't do. And so there's always a degree of risk. I pray before I go to work. We all will die sometime, and I trust God, and I try to be as careful as I can be. But operating in fear is a miserable way to live. So there's a certain freedom when you are working on a team where everybody is almost mutually taking the same risk, and you trust each other, and where you're not even thinking of yourself at that point. You're just working as a team, and you're not thinking about self-preservation so much as accomplishing the goal. And I think a lot of guys who've served in the military or things like that understand kind of that brotherhood from that. And that is probably one of the positive aspects of working in where there's a threat around you.
Yep. Yeah, miserable way to live with fear. I like that. So, last question. There's probably some good uses of fear you see in your work. So there's not all bad things related to fear, but there are things that you kind of maybe hope some people would be afraid of doing. And so do you see a positive and negative application of fear in your work with the people you work with?
Yes. So I often tell people when they're meeting with me in the office, you have two motivators. One is you're either running towards something because you want it, or you're running away from it because you're afraid of it. And a lot of probation and parole is a fear motivation that if you don't pass this UA, or if you don't go to this domestic violence intervention class, you will go back to jail. So that's a powerful fear motivation. what I've found with fear motivation is as soon as the threat is gone, the motivation is gone. And so short term, you can twist anyone's arm behind their back and make them do what you want. But as soon as you lose the power to hold that over their head, they're going to do whatever they want. And so I'm always trying to kind of reach behind the curtain and say, I understand I can force you to do this, but you'll do it because otherwise, you're going to have to go back to jail for a year. But I would much rather you do it because you want to do it, and then when you get off of paper, you're not going to return to the criminal justice system because your relationship, your way of living has changed versus just I did what I had to do to get by because I was afraid and to comply. And then as soon as that is gone, now I'm going to go right back to my ways. So heart change is difficult, but a lot of people do make those changes. I think that the guys in this congregation who are involved in prison ministries see that happen. I think, sometimes there's no telling when that light bulb will switch for somebody. I've seen it where somebody was in their 50s, when somebody was in their 20s. Sometimes they just get tired of it, or sometimes they say, I want to try something different, and they're just looking for somebody to help them. And so if they can see that you care, then the fear doesn't have to be the primary motivation for obedience. So.
Yeah, I'm so grateful we have a God who understands that and who draws us with love. And thank you, Joel. It's kind of awkward to sit and talk with me in front of a bunch of people, but we're family, and it's valuable stuff you have to share. So thank you for doing that. And we'll invite Keone up. Yeah, Joel's somebody you want a relationship with him from church, not from his work. That's the good place to start your relationship. I'm sure he'd treat you nice at work too. But Keone, come up and help us understand some things. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pastor. Let's see here. So last week we talked about QAnon, and we talked about some of the interesting trends we've seen on the right. Well, today it's the other side's turn, because if we're going to study extremism, we need to be strictly apolitical. No magic button for me. So, elements of extremism. Just a reminder from week 1 on what the elements are, because we will see most, if not all of these again. So what are we talking about? The past year, and I'm not going to go too far into the riots because unfortunately I don't have a huge amount of information from non-mainstream media sources about all of this in terms of anarchy. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. What I am going to talk about are some of the groups that we've been seeing the past 4 years. So one of the major groups we have to talk about is the Anarchist Movement. Now the Anarchist Movement is very, very broad, and that's putting it very, very simply. They are an extraordinarily diverse group of ideologies mixed together, but their general idea, what most anarchists will all agree on, is that hierarchy and established order, their hierarchy is tyranny, right? So any form of system, any form of government is inherently tyrannical and must be gotten rid of. We have to have in their view, a sort of collective body of people that just kind of all agree to do an action. They don't necessarily, they reject all forms of government, they reject all forms of organization, and they view it as tyrannical. Some of the groups you're seeing on there's 3 flags there. The top one is the anarcho-pacifists, for example. They're very, very interesting because they view violence as a form of authority, a form of force, and something that must be avoided at all cost because it goes against the anarchist way of life. The middle are the anarcho-capitalists, and truth be told, I don't really understand them because they don't fit into the anarchist club, but they view themselves as part of the anarchist club, and they view capitalism, restricted capitalism, is wrong. And the green and black flag is the anarcho-primitivists, or the anarcho-greens. They share a flag. And they essentially believe that we should return society to a primitive state of being, to a tribal state of being, because it's in league with nature, and it gets rid of all of these, again, when it comes to the anarchist principles, it gets rid of the state, it gets rid of the hierarchy that they hate so much. So before we go into Antifa, because Antifa is one of the major groups that was talked about quite frequently last year, we have to understand where some of their ancestors came from. So in this sense, we're going to start in the 1960s and 1970s. The 1960s and 1970s, and in going into the 80s, that was the high time for leftist extremism in the United States, and especially in terms of left-wing terrorism. So the Weather Underground formed, and it was a split off from the Students for a Democratic Society, which was an anti-war movement. It was against the Vietnam War. And so what happened was, Weather Underground had a group of militants, and these militants went on to form the Weather Underground. Originally they were called the Weathermen Underground, but they decided that that name was not inclusive enough, so they called it the Weather Underground. After 25 plus bombings and a triple murder, they were broken up by the FBI, and a lot of their members were arrested. But they're still around. There's a few members to keep in mind. Bill Ayers was the leader of the Weather Underground. He's still around, and he still goes around teaching, I think, at college campuses from time to time. And the other two people that I think you should remember for a little bit later on in this seminar are Eric Mann and Susan Rosenberg. Hold on to those names, they're important, they'll come back later, I swear. So, after they were broken up, there were two organizations that kind of came around their time and then after their time. When the Weather Underground was operating, they had a split. A lot of extremist groups split, it happens. There's disagreements on the ways and methods to go about things. The Weather Underground split into two groups initially because there was a disagreement on class warfare versus racial warfare. And what I mean by racial warfare, I mean the Black Liberation Army and some of those organizations. So the Weather Underground went their way, and the people who disagreed with them went and they formed the May 19th Communist Organization, called May 19th because it was the birth of Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong at the same time. So M19 goes and they're doing their thing, the Weathermen are going and doing their thing, and another group comes up, and allegedly, I'm not 100% certain on this, unfortunately. There's not a huge amount of resources on some of these groups. Allegedly, the May the 19th Communist Organization went and formed the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee as a front organization. Well, M19 eventually dies out for the very same reason the Weathermen die out. The FBI gets a hold of them. So the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee ends up being a hodgepodge of former Weathermen, Black Liberation Army, M19, and a few other organizations that are running around out there. And what do they support? Well, these are very, very familiar. Very, very familiar if we are looking at some of the things we've been seeing the past 4 or 5 years. So the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee's main stance was fighting the Klan. Fighting the Klan in the streets, fighting the Klan in the schools, fighting the Klan anywhere they could find them. They frequently accused the Reagan administration of white supremacy. They endorsed the May the 19th Communist Organization with their bank robberies. And they promoted communist insurgencies in South America, Nicaragua, and I think Colombia as well. Colombia still has a communist guerrilla force out there. FARC still exists, so there's the longest running group that's out there so far. So why does this matter? Why do these groups matter? Well, around 1989, in the United States, and in the late 80s and early 90s, the Midwest is struggling with a new form of extremism. And that came in the form of the white supremacist skinheads with Tom Metzger and the White Aryan Resistance. Well, this wasn't going to stand because the skinheads, the white supremacist skinheads, were very heavy into the music scene, the metal scene. So what happened? Anti-racist action gets formed around 1989 to combat their influence. Allegedly, again, this is alleged because I'm not sure some of the sources on this are a little bit sketchy, so I'm not quite sure how true this is. But allegedly, they were helped they were helped with their formation by the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. By 1994, anti-racist action has expanded into the Midwest Anti-Fascist Network. And then, in 2007, some members of anti-racist action go and form the very first group that ever uses the name Antifa, and they form Rose City Antifa in Portland in 2007. So that is the first time Antifa is ever used in that term, in that sense. So what does this mean? Antifa is not an organization, but Antifa is not an idea either. It lives in this bizarre gray zone between the two. Because you have to remember, anarchists do not believe in organization. They don't believe in hierarchy. They don't believe in structure. And something that was taught to left-wing extremists very quickly during the 30 years they were in their heyday, from the 1960s to the 1980s, they learned very quickly that organization, hierarchy, having public figures is a very bad idea when you have a very competent federal agency going after you for terrorism offenses. So this broke them up very, very rapidly. So what is their ideology? Well, Antifa, if you see the black and red flags are symbolic of anarcho-communism. So anarcho-communism takes the principles of anarchy that we've talked about before, and it combines them with the teachings of Marx and Lenin and groups like that. Ironically, there are anarchists, the pure anarchists, the ones that just wave only black flags and no other colors. There's a stream of thinking within the anarchist movement that says that anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-communism are oxymoronic when it comes down to the anarchist movement, because they always inherently lead to tyrannical systems. So, anarcho-communism, it is a combination of anarchy and communism. Most specifically, Antifa wants the deconstruction of everything. They want the deconstruction of the United States government, they want the deconstruction of our law system, they want the deconstruction of any system that has any form of authority or any sense of regularity. They want it gone. They want it replaced with their perfect anarcho-communist, I don't know what you would even call it, a commune? Something like that? The other major thing that makes Antifa special in comparison to, say, other anarcho-communists is this. There may be anarcho-communists, but they don't necessarily all align with Antifa, and this is why. Antifa is very, very focused on confronting what they view as fascism or white supremacists or promoters of these ideas in public, more so than any other anarchist movement per se. Because again, you have to look at their origins. They originated from, some of their ideas originated from a group called Anti-Racist Action. So what do? Well, they use all sorts of methods, violent and non-violent. They dox people. And the purpose of doxing, what they want to do is they go and they find the information of the people, they find the stuff that they said that was offensive to them or that they believe is white supremacist or otherwise, and their goal is to get these people completely ostracized from society, right? So they use harassment, again, you see the riots up there, that was the Battle of Berkeley back in, I think, in 2016. Something you'll see in that picture, if you can't quite read it, I'll read it. It says, "Liberals get the bullet too." We'll talk about that in a second. So what is the idea behind their violence? Well, they believe that if we are violent enough, if we are offensive enough, and we confront these people enough, we can force them out of society and their ideas will never gain traction. And their idea from this comes from the idea that if the communists in the Weimar era Germany were just a little bit more violent and a little bit more confrontational, and they did what they had to do, that the Nazis never would have come around. That's their idea. And this idea does not work. And I'll explain why that doesn't work, and I'll explain it at the end, because something we have to remember is that when it comes to radicalization and extremism, one of the major ways you get someone to radicalize is through traumatic event. And what do you think assaulting someone is? So how do they operate? why do they appear so organized? Why do they wear all black? Well, in the 1980s, the leftist movements in Germany, they are the autonomists, which are essentially anarcho-communists, went and they decided that if they needed to have a way to thwart police, to prevent themselves from getting arrested, and to intimidate their foes. So what they formed the first use of black bloc tactics. You wear all black, you wear your hood, you put your sunglasses on, you put the mask on, and everyone dresses the same way. Antifa, which they operate a few websites, and I pulled some of this information directly from their websites, operates using affinity groups. Now, what is this affinity group? Affinity groups are small groups of activists. And usually when it comes down to this, they're all friends, or their family, or their found family, or adopted family, whatever it is. These are small groups of people that essentially live together, and they go, and they can trust each other, and they operate in a collectivist sort of way. They all have to agree on the course of action they're taking before they go do it. What does this mean? Well, affinity groups can break off, reform, split apart, and reorganize the same day, as fast as they want to, as the conditions need. They can go and they can just reform. What makes it so uniform, though, is the fact that they all play by the same playbook. They all play with black bloc tactics. They all read the same manuals. They all do that sort of, they all use the same tactics. Because if people don't use all those tactics, they get caught by the police. They get caught and they get to go see Joel. So this gives Antifa the appearance of something that has a great amount of organization and forethought and planning, when in reality, they all operate by the same playbook. Some examples of them promoting violence. It takes a bullet to bash a fash. You can't read the one on the right, or the left for you guys, but it says it's an anti-fascist, it's an Antifa rally that happened in Philadelphia sometime last year, and it says, "Make the guillotine red again." The one on the top right for you is, "We don't want Biden, we want revenge." This happened immediately after the inauguration, actually. And that's something we have to remember. Extremist groups only are your friend as long as they need you, right? If you're a politician, or you're a political group, or you're a part of an organization, that extremist group will be your friend as long as they need you. And the moment they don't need you, they will go back to hating you, and they will go back to wanting to destroy you. And that is what is true when it comes to Antifa. Antifa doesn't like the Democrats. They don't. The members of Antifa, when you talk to them, they do not like the Democrats. They want them to be destroyed along with the conservatives, along with what they view as the fash, because they're all part of a system that is tyrannical, according to them. Before we move on to this group, before we move on to BLM, well, no, we're just going to move on to BLM. I've changed my mind. I apologize. So BLM is the other major group that we're going to talk about, and they've been around since about 2013. Now, there's something to consider when it comes to this group in particular. There are many, many different BLMs. There are street movements, and then there is the organization. And we're going to be talking about the organization because they get the most of the money and they have some of the most, let's call them interesting of people. But we have to remember that there is a difference between these groups. I have no issue with the street movements, by and large. If they say something that I disagree with, they say something I disagree with, I have no issue with them. BLMGN, though, the Global Networks Project, and I'll refer to the organization as BLMGN for now on, so that we are all on the same book when we talk about these guys, is different. And why are they different? Well, they're a multi-million-dollar organization that pushes Marxism. That's what the problem is. Maybe. Maybe not. There we go. So what are the divisions? I'll illuminate some of the divisions that we've been seeing. And we've been seeing these divisions the past 5 or 6 months, actually. It's just not very well reported so far. Just this week, Just this week, Michael Brown Sr., who you might remember from the 2014 Ferguson incident, Michael Brown Sr. and the International Black Freedom Alliance recently just demanded from BLMGN $20 million. Now, why did they do this? Well, Black Lives Matter, BLMGN was formed in 2013, but they were nothing until the 2014 Ferguson riots, or 2014 Ferguson incident, when it came down to all of that. And so BLM goes to Fort Ferguson, and we all know what happened there. And immediately afterwards, while they're there, Michael Brown Sr. and the International Black Freedom Alliance, they're trying to work on creating a community center in Ferguson and do some more outreach in that community. And BLM just abandons them. They don't give them money, they don't give them support, they just leave, right? And this is not a unique occurrence. BLM-GN frequently, repeatedly leaves the local groups on their own, all the time. November 2020. November 2020, 10 different BLM local chapters go and they sign a statement condemning BLMGN for questionable financial practices because the organization isn't clear about where their financing is, and they have never given a single, I can't say they never have. They have so far not given money to any of the local chapters they claim to support. Something else that happened that I guess that probably made them upset was the fact that earlier that June, BLMGN went and formed a grassroots movement. So all of the movements, all of the local groups that have been out there since 2013, even before the actual organization formed, have not gotten a dime, and now BLMGN has said, we really actually don't want you because you're not pushing our agenda, so we're forming BLM grassroots to push new movements where you're already at. There's a difference between the movement on the street and the organization that is operating and has a nonprofit status out of Delaware. Something interesting with their finances to be noted is that between 2017 and 2019, they spent $900,000 on travel, $1.6 million on consulting, $2.1 million on staff, and absolutely nothing on the local groups like they promised. So what are their founders? In 2013, George Zimmerman was acquitted for his shooting of Trayvon Martin, and the BLM hashtag goes viral. At that same year, BLM-GN is formed by Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi. So, two of these names are very, very important to us, and you'll see why. So BLM-GN, from the very start, always promoted a highly Marxist ideology. They want the destruction of the nuclear family, right? They want a dismantling of society as the way a dismantling of society in the way that it currently stands. And when the key word there, the dismantling of the nuclear family, is very, very specific, and you should always raise a red flag anytime you ever see that, because whenever you see that, they're always quoting or referencing Friedrich Engels. Well, Friedrich Engels was the other half of the Karl Marx partnership, because Marx didn't just write all of his ideas on his own. He collaborated with Friedrich Engels quite a bit. And Engels, when he was helping Marx create his theory, when he was helping create Marxism and the idea of communism, he stated that the nuclear family is a product of capitalism, used by the bourgeoisie to keep everyone down, and it must be destroyed along with capitalism. We as Christians have a problem with that. So, ultimately speaking, BLM-GN was more focused on the dismantling of mainstream society than it was on racial justice, which they claim to support. This isn't the only problem, not even by far. So last year they made, in 8 months, $90 million. And this is unique because a fair amount of money came from this leftist grant group called 1,000 Currents. And who's on the board of directors for 1,000 Currents? Susan Rosenberg, a very familiar name. What did Susan Rosenberg do to get her arrested? Well, Susan Rosenberg, back in the 1970s, was caught with 750 pounds of explosives and automatic weapons. And I'm not talking like the media description of automatic weapons. I mean like real Uzis, like real actual automatic weapons. And she might have also been involved, although she was never, I don't think she was ever tried with it ultimately because of the fact that she was supposed to spend 58 years in prison. She was also suspected to be tied to the triple murder that was committed by the Weather Underground. So what happened? She was sentenced to 58 years in prison, and she only served 16 because at the very end of her 16th year in prison, Bill Clinton pardoned her. The other interesting person that is involved with this is Eric Mann. And Eric Mann was also arrested with the Weathermen because he was part of a group that went and did a drive-by shooting at a police station. No one died, but a couple of bullets went through the police station's windows. He ended up spending 18 months in prison. Well, who is he a mentor to? Patrice Cullors and Alicia Garza, who in an interview have stated that they are trained Marxists. So the Weather Underground has managed to cast a very, very big shadow even decades after they've been destroyed. This is not the only influence, though. BLMGN has a very interesting relationship with Nation of Islam. And in case anyone has forgotten what Nation of Islam is about, Nation of Islam is some of their founders, Elijah Muhammad and Louis Farrakhan, they promote certain ideas. One of those ideas being that Judaism is a gutter religion. They also spout interesting theories such as white people are inherently or genetically violent and genetically inferior, and other hateful ideologies such as that. And they have a lot of support among BLMGN. Melina Abdullah is currently still an organizer for the organization in LA. Last year, I think it was around March, BLM protesters marched through Fairfax. Now, if you're not from LA, you won't know the significance of that. Fairfax is the Jewish community in LA. There's synagogues, there's religious schools, and as this BLM protest marched through, they decided that they were going to vandalize these. They decided they're going to vandalize these synagogues and these religious schools, these Jewish religious schools. And they marched through shouting some expletives about the police and saying that they were going to kill the Jews. The rabbi in the area compared it to Kristallnacht, actually. And when she's confronted on her actions and when she's asked why she did this and why she's not condemning it, she said, "This is a rebellion. This is an uprising. We're justified." And later goes on to I think her daughter even goes on later to say that the actions were justified because the community was all white. Something to keep in mind is that Melina Abdullah is also a huge fan and outspoken supporter of Louis Farrakhan, the man, probably one of the most prolific anti-Semites in the United States as of even now. Another organizer in Tennessee has been a featured speaker at several different Nation of Islam conferences and also defends him quite frequently. Other activists have promoted the blood libel accusation, and if you weren't here for my QAnon seminar, the blood libel accusation involves Jews killing children for power, essentially. It is an accusation. It is a conspiracy theory that has existed since the Middle Ages. The picture you're seeing here is a still from a video where a group of BLM activists were marching through a neighborhood shouting, "Israel, we know you. You kill children too," promoting these ideas. After George Floyd died, some of the new conspiracy came about that police are being sent overseas to Israel to be trained in torture tactics by the Israelis. Now, where does some of this come from? Well, this anti-Semitism doesn't just come from Nation of Islam. They publicly, back in 2016, support BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. And BDS is a Palestinian organization, and what they want is they want us to boycott Israel and remove their funding from the U.S. government and to sanction them. Why? Well, they consider armed struggle against Israel to be a legitimate right. They've never condemned Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and their leader, their founder, has said, we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Israel. They essentially want the destruction of that state entirely. Patrisse Cullors, yet again, in 2015, went to meet with the leader of BDS in the West Bank and came back saying, oh, this is an apartheid state, and if we deny that, then we are part of the Zionist violence. And this resulted in BLMGN and some of the more radical groups going and signing the Black Solidarity Statement with Palestine. Zionists. It's a very interesting term to use. I think Martin Luther King had something to say about that. When people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism. This is not the only violence they espouse, though. They are very, very pro-BLA, Black Liberation Army, in many ways. They espouse the teachings of Assata Shakur, also known as Joan Chesimard, currently still the only woman on a most wanted terrorist list from the FBI. She's currently residing in Cuba and has a $1 million reward out for her, so keep that in mind, I guess. They have supported the release of Black Liberation Army members, Herman Bell and Anthony Bottom. And what did they do? Well, they murdered 3 police officers, one of them execution style. And just recently, back last year, you had in New York, one of the organizers going and saying, if this country doesn't give us what we want, we're going to burn it all to the ground and replace it. With what, I wonder, with your Marxist ideas? So what are the problems? From our perspective, there's a few. Marxism and communism are incompatible with Christianity as a whole. Secondly, submission to the authorities is talked about in the Bible many, many times, and it is a biblical rejection of anarchy. And thirdly, violence begets violence. Let's start with number 1. Marxism inherently, if we ignore everything else that it does, it replaces God with, quote unquote, the people or the state. We all know that there is only one God, and he is not the people or the state. Something else that should be mentioned is that Marx was extraordinarily anti-religion. He viewed it as the opiate of the masses, essentially a mass delusion to make the proletariat feel better about themselves, and an obstacle, to him it was an obstacle in his way for a proletariat revolution. And if we just look at the body count, let's look at the victims of Communism Memorial Foundation counts between 43 million to 162 million who were killed by communist regimes. And that's not even, they by their own accord, have not even counted the people who died by accident from starvation due to failed policies or some other unhappy accident due to their poor economic planning. So Marxism is a bit of a problem. What about submission to authority? The Bible talks about it many, many times. Romans 13, 1 through 7, 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17, Titus 3, 1 through 2, and 1 Timothy 2, I messed up that Bible verse. We'll see which one it is in the future slide. Titus 3, 1 through 2. Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient and to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, and to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy towards all people. 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it is to the emperor as supreme or to the governors sent to them to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. And of course, this is done with the admonition of so long as a law does not violate the laws of God, well, then we're supposed to honor it. Until it violates the law of God, we still have to obey the law. What about violence? Why can't we punch Nazis in the face? Why is this a bad idea? Well, for starters, and Jesus had something to say about this, Matthew 26:52. Then Jesus said to him, Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. If we're talking about some of these groups that promote violence, like Antifa, where they view that violence is the only way to deal with these problems, they forget that you take up the sword, you will die by the sword. Martin Luther King even has a large segment on this, on why we can't use violence. And we're just going to read this out real quick. Hate begets hate. Violence begets violence. Toughness begets a greater toughness. We must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. Our aim must be never to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor can you establish the truth. Through violence you murder the hater, but you do not murder the hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding a deeper layer of darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And that, my friends, is a Christian lifestyle. Loving our enemies despite the fact that they hate us. Right? And these ideas that these groups are pushing in the name of justice and equality, it never leads to that when it uses violence, and it never leads to that when it comes to Marxism. So, let love drive out hate. And that's the end of this seminar. We will move over to the side rooms to talk more about this. Thanks, Ryan.
So we invite you to stick around for the conversation. If you need to get going, that's just fine. But we have some tables out here. We're just going to have some discussion time. We don't have like guided questions for every time. We're just talking in response to these things. So I'll give you a few things you might think about. What do you do with the information you just heard? That's a question to start on. The last 2 weeks we've looked at two different extremes, and both of them are terrifying realities. As Christians, is it just good stuff to know, or what are we supposed to do with that? How do we respond in love to a world that appears to be possessed by the wrong spirit? How do we do these things? And how do we go into a future where we know that these things will increase and yet bring the power of the gospel we have and try to give it to people who want to destroy us? Those are some questions to wrestle with. If you want to tie back to the sermons you've heard, you might think if you can come up with your own 5 ways to lose like a winner, and some good stuff to talk about. So there's no shortage of things to talk about. And if you want to stick around, we'll have a good time there. I'll close this time with prayer and look forward to discussion on the other side. Father in heaven, we pray for a very mixed up world. The people who do these acts of violence are people you created and love. And I can't imagine how your heart hurts when they put forth an activism that is so against your character. And I pray that you'd help us to process these in a healthy way. Thank you for the clarity of understanding that you've given Keone to be able to share a whole bunch of information and ideologies with us in a meaningful way. I pray you'd help us think through these things. And bless us as we do in Jesus' name. Amen. Look forward to seeing